Welcome to our 6th lesson of 8 on the book of Job. Today we will be in the 32nd chapter and really the 32nd through the 37th chapters as we meet a new character, Elihu. But before we get there, let me tell you a little bit of a story. Years ago, a young man who was a part of our church had moved off and then had kind of come back, made an appointment with me and wanted to talk with me. And so we went out to lunch together, and I was kind of thinking that maybe what he was doing was going to ask me my opinion on something or had some issue or problem that he wanted my wisdom for. Maybe I should have known better, because actually he wanted to give to me some of his wisdom. Now, he was about 19 or 20 years old maybe at the time, and he had decided that I was not pastoring the church the way that I ought to. I wasn't being the leader that I should. I wasn't getting the church ready for the next century and all those kind of things. This was back in the late 90s. And he really took me to task in a very kind way. He basically said, "You don't know anything, and I know everything about being a pastor." And it didn't matter that I had 10 or 12 years of being a pastor under my belt, and I'd been trained for this and all this kind of stuff. And he didn't have all of that. He knew better than me. Now, I have to say, some of the things that he was saying was correct, and I really struggled. I tried to listen. I tried to hear what he had to say, but his arrogance was just so overwhelming. It was really, really hard. And so I basically just kind of waited him out, and I let him speak and speak and speak and tell me all the ways that the church could be better if only the church would listen to him and this sort of thing. And then lunch finally blessedly ended, and we went on our ways. Now, a few years later, he came back, and he said to me, "You know, I think over and over about that lunch that we had together, and I was so arrogant, and I'm so sorry." And I said, "Well, yeah, you were pretty confident, but some of the things you had to say were right, and I needed to hear them, and I did hear them, and I made some changes in the way that I did things, particularly in the lines of technology and with our website and our social media and that kind of stuff." And he was right about those things, and even though I may have been older and wiser, he did have some perspectives that I need to pay attention to. And that's sort of what is going on in today's lesson, maybe exaggerated even more though. We have now spent 31 chapters in the book of Job, and of those 31 chapters, a little over 30 of them have been Job and his friends going back and forth talking about what has happened to Job and why it's happened to Job, and Job asking a lot of questions of God and wanting to know why this has happened to me, and Job defending his innocence with his friends kind of decrying his guilt. And into this comes Elihu. Job and his friends have finally run out of words. There's nothing left to say. They're kind of exasperated with each other. And Elihu is this guy who's kind of been off on the periphery, just listening. He's a younger man. He maybe isn't even a friend of Job's, but he's been paying attention, and he knows what is going on, and he is angry. He's an angry young man who thinks that he has all of the answers. And so with that little bit of prelude, let me read for you the beginning of Elihu's speeches, and it is Job, the 32nd chapter, the first 10 verses. "So these three men," that's Job's friends, "these three men ceased to answer Job, because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, son of Barachel the Buzite of the family of Ram, became angry. He was angry at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He was angry also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, though they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. But when Elihu saw there was no answer in the mouths of these three men, he became angry. Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered, 'I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to me. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But truly it is the spirit in a mortal, the breath of the Almighty, that makes for understanding. It is not the old that are wise, nor the aged that understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me, let me also declare my opinion.'" And so he has been waiting to speak now for 30-some chapters. He is now going to speak for 6 full chapters. Neither Job nor his friends nor God are going to get a word in edgewise. And interestingly, none of them also are ever going to respond to him at all. Never refer to him or anything else. It's just almost, you could take these 6 chapters and lift them out of the book, and the book would still stand on its own. It's very interesting, and yet there is a lot in these 6 chapters, I think, that we can learn, some positive lessons, and maybe even more importantly, some negative lessons. I can imagine Elihu coming back to Job in later years and kind of apologizing to him the way that my friend did to me and said, I know I had some pretty good stuff to say, but I said it with such arrogance that I know that I hurt you rather than helped you. And that's really Elihu's crime, is that his arrogance and his confidence leads him to hurt Job more than it does to bring Job to any sense of help. And so I think we ought to look at a few of the things that Elihu had to say and see where there's wisdom and where there is just arrogance, or maybe even worse. Now, we've already discovered that Elihu is an angry young man. He's angry at Job because he thinks that Job is being self-righteous, perhaps even claiming to be more righteous than God. And there's an element of truth, perhaps, to that in some of Job's speeches. He's angry at the 3 friends because they can't really put their finger on the problem. And they've been talking and talking and talking, but they couldn't put their finger on the problem. And I also think he's angry because they haven't been able to get Job to confess his sin, and they've spent all this time talking, and nothing has happened. And I can really imagine this young man kind of sitting on the periphery and kind of listening to what Job and his friends have to say, but what he's really hearing is just blah, 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 because he knows better than they do. He's kind of like Mark Twain, when Mark Twain said that when I was 14, my old man was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have him around. But when I became 21, it was amazing how much the old guy had learned in 7 years. He knows everything. This is somewhat the arrogance of youth. You may also have seen the bumper sticker that says, hire a teenager, they know everything. That's kind of what's going on here. In verse 8, he basically says, you don't have to be old and wise or be old in order to be wise, but the ones who are wise are those that have the breath of the Almighty in them. And he is correct in that, and oftentimes it is the young who get a word from the Lord. I think of Jeremiah, who gets a word from the Lord when he's very, very young and thinks that he's too young to speak, and God says, no, I'm going to tell you what to do. I think of Samuel also, who as a young boy was given wisdom, and yet Elihu is claiming this for himself, and maybe that's where we have some problems. As a matter of fact, Elihu in the 36th chapter is going to make this amazing claim. He's going to describe himself as one who is perfect in knowledge. And the way he says it is, one who is perfect in knowledge is with you. And maybe you ought to listen to the one who is perfect in knowledge, and he's talking about himself. So let's think for a minute about Elihu's anger. Why is he really angry? And I want to suggest that one of the things that makes us angry, and when we sometimes miss this, when we get angry at other people, what we are angry at is we see ourselves in them. What makes us angriest at other people is sometimes traits that they have that we recognize that we have as well. So let me give you an example, and as a personal example. I get really frustrated with people when they're telling a story and they just go on and on and on about all these details in the story that don't really have anything to do with the point of the story they're trying to make. And it's just frustrating to me. I'm almost kind of rolling my eyes and tapping my feet and just waiting for them to finish that story. And yet one of the reasons I know that makes me angry and makes me frustrated is that I do that. Boy, do I love to tell a story. And sometimes the stories I tell have way too many details. Preaching is a good solution to that, because when I'm preaching, I'm always trying to cut out the extraneous details because I want to have as much in my sermons or in my Bible studies as I can. But I know that's one of my faults. And so when I am impatient with other people, part of that anger is really anger at myself, because I know there have been times that I've droned on and on and on and made other people listen to stories they don't want to hear and listen to details that aren't really all that important. And I think that's part of what is going on here. Elihu accuses Job of being arrogant and self-righteous. Well, it takes one to know one, and one who says, well, I am perfect in knowledge, has a little bit of arrogance and self-righteousness in them for sure. And then he's angry at the friends for droning on, but never really getting to the point, and he's going to drone on and on for 6 chapters, and we still have at this point 5.5 chapters to go to hear what he has to say. And so perhaps he sees himself in Job and his friends more than he cares to admit, and who he's really angry with is himself. Well, somewhat amazingly, part of Elihu's argument is that God punishes the arrogant. He has said that the friends couldn't put their finger on Job's sin. It wasn't a sexual sin. It wasn't the sin of idolatry. He didn't murder anybody. It's none of these gross sins that would be obvious. Elihu thinks he understands. The sin is the sin of arrogance, of self-righteousness, of thinking that he is perfect. And again, it's funny that Elihu thinks that that is what how God is punishing Job, because he's got a lot of that in himself as well. His last words in the whole book are these, Elihu's last words. God does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. And yet we wonder, would God even regard Elihu? Because he seems to be somewhat wise only in his own conceit. So he's angry. He's angry because of arrogance. And he's sitting back and he's paying attention and he's listening. And then he pronounces judgment, even though nobody's really asked for his opinion. When Hurricane Katrina hit and devastated New Orleans and many of the surrounding areas and states, there were some fairly prominent preachers, angry preachers, who declared that New Orleans is one of the most sinful cities in the United States, and that God had finally gotten tired of Bourbon Street and all of its excesses, and had gotten tired of Mardi Gras and all of its debauchery, and so it had sent Hurricane Katrina as punishment to New Orleans and as warning to the rest of the United States. The problem with this is, of course, that it wasn't only Bourbon Street that got affected. And some of the people who were most profiting from New Orleans' sins weren't affected at all. They didn't live in New Orleans, and their businesses were well insured, and they were able to recover and go on as normal. The people who were hurt most by Katrina were some of the poorest and neediest people in that area. And some of the neighborhoods that were most hit were some of the poorest neighborhoods. One of the towns that was hit was Pass Christian in Mississippi, just across the border from Louisiana on the other side of the Mississippi River. And Pass Christian was a very small town. It was a very poor town, and they had made a choice some years before not to allow the Mississippi River gambling boats to come and dock on their portion of the river. Now, had they allowed gambling in their town, they would have profited. They would have been a much wealthier town, but they made that choice that they didn't think that gambling was a good influence that they wanted in their community, and so they didn't have it, and they had suffered somewhat for that choice. They were a poor town, and that was one of the hardest hit towns. There was not a single building that was undamaged, and most of them were completely blown away. The Hurricane Katrina almost wiped Pass Christian off the map. Now, was Pass Christian sinless? No, of course it wasn't. But it also wasn't guilty of the debauchery and the gambling and all of the other sin that the preachers were seeing. And I wonder, what would a preacher say to a young woman, maybe a young woman from Pass Christian, whose children died in Hurricane Katrina? Well, this was because of the sin of New Orleans. Well, then why would God punish those children for the sin of New Orleans? Surely they were innocent. And I really wonder the same thing about Job. If Job might not, if he were to respond to Elihu, say, okay, if I'm guilty of arrogance and I'm guilty of sin and God wants to punish me, come after me, God. But why would you go after my children? And presumably there may have been grandchildren as well who died, though the text doesn't make that clear. It doesn't say that was the case. But why would you go after innocent children if I'm the one that you are trying to punish? Surely God's punishment can be a little more specific than that. And so I think that's a warning to us to make sure that when we are on the periphery, when we're on the outside, if we are a preacher or a televangelist hundreds of miles away, to be careful about making proclamations about who was right and who was wrong, and how God was involved in some tragedy, because we might just be making fools of ourselves rather than actually shedding light on the situation. But Job doesn't answer Elihu. He just basically waits him out, and he may have just given up on anyone trying to really understand him. His three friends have finally exhausted all of their words, and Job has no response to them. Elihu now spends 6 chapters, and he kind of exhausts himself, and Job doesn't respond. And Job may have even given up almost on hearing from God, although he is going to hear from God, and that will be next week's lesson. But of course, before we get there, I want us to do some real quick application from what we can learn from Elihu and from his speeches. And first, I think we can learn, let's be careful about giving unsolicited advice, especially when we're on the periphery or we're eavesdropping on some situation, because that advice, even if it's good advice, is probably not going to be well received. You may remember a few weeks ago in a sermon I told the story about the man in Texas who set up a listening tent and said anybody wanted to come and just talk with him, he would listen. And one of the rules that he made for himself was, I'm not going to give anybody any advice unless they ask for it. And that was a pretty good rule. But can you imagine if I or you were standing just outside the tent and we were listening, and as soon as we got an idea of whatever problem the person was who was offering the problem to this man, we barged into that space and said, let me give you some advice. Well, it would not be well received. And we need to be careful that we don't do that for others as well. We need to offer them empathy and compassion. We need to offer them help in any way that we can, but not perhaps in the terms of advice unless they ask for it. And then even then say, not if I were you, because I think that's a little bit arrogant, but say, here are some things you might think about. Here are some things you might try. Here is something that I might try, maybe would be a little bit better. Secondly, let's pay attention to when we get angry at someone. And let's do a little test and see, is that anger that I'm having toward that person not because they're wrong, but because I'm seeing myself in them? Let's also recognize that anger is oftentimes a misplaced fear. And so what I'm angry because I'm really afraid, but I don't want to admit that fear. Politicians do this to us all the time. They try to make us afraid, so we'll get angry. And then if we're angry enough, we'll vote against the other person. And so often we say, I'm not voting for anybody, I'm voting against someone else. Well, that's because we've allowed one side or the other to make us fearful, but rather than admitting our fear, it makes us angry. And so we go and we try to do something to vote against them. Anger is sometimes misplaced fear. And if we recognize what we're afraid of, we can recognize what God tells us, that perfect love casts out fear. And so we can develop a love for God or a love for others, and that will let the fear dissipate. I wonder, number 3, let us learn to use the phrase, what I'm hearing you say is. If you've ever been in counseling, it's a pretty good chance your counselor used that phrase. And they use it because it's a powerful phrase. Because it isn't a phrase that offers advice. It's a phrase that helps people clarify what they're thinking and feeling. And it's also a phrase that helps us be able to say to another, I understand how you are thinking or feeling. We husbands, I'm a husband, we are often fixers for the problems in our wives' lives. And our wives often don't want us to fix their problems. They just want us to understand and maybe to help them clarify how they are feeling and how they are thinking. When Lee and I had not been married for long, she was having some difficulty in work, and she would come home and complain about what had happened at work that day. And originally I would say, well, here's what you need to do. You go back in there tomorrow and you do this, that, or the other. And she almost quit telling me when she would come home from work how things were going or what was happening, because she didn't need my advice. She didn't want my advice. What she wanted was somebody who loved her and who could understand her and understand that this had been a frustrating day at work. And she wanted me also to recognize that she was smart enough to know what she needed to do to maybe try to address the problem. That wasn't what she needed. She just needed understanding from me. What if Elihu and Job's friends had said to him, what I'm hearing you say, Job, is, and Job would say, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Or maybe Job would say, well, yeah, that's what I said, but that's not really what I meant. What I really meant was, and that would help Job kind of clarify for himself. They might have really helped him, where we know from the book they didn't. The end of 31st chapter, it says Job's friends quit talking because they recognized they weren't helping. Elihu didn't help Job at all because Job never says, gee, thanks a whole lot, Elihu. They just blew a bunch of advice out that Job didn't need or didn't want, or that certainly wasn't helpful. But finally, I think it is important, let us recognize that sometimes we have met the enemy and they are partly right. That was a book that Tony Campolo wrote a number of years ago. And so even when we have people who are offering us advice or giving us things that we don't think we need and we don't think we're being very helpful, maybe we need to listen to them. That young man who came to share with me some of the things that he thought our church ought to be doing, or some things that I ought to be doing better as a pastor, he wasn't all wrong. And I needed to listen to him, and I'm really thankful that I did. And in some ways, I got a little bit of a jump start maybe on the digital revolution that we were going through, because this young person who understood that better than I did came and talked with me. We need to recognize maybe there is something in the advice, even unsolicited advice that others give us, but also we need to know maybe there isn't. In 1 John, we're told to test every spirit to see whether or not it comes from God. And it's okay to recognize that sometimes the spirit may not come from God. In Elihu's case, I think he made had two really great things to say that really were truthful. And one was that Job probably was being more self-righteous than he should have been. Job was basically having a pity party because he had convinced himself, I am completely innocent, I'm completely okay, and I'm being punished for no good reason, and I don't know why God is punishing me, but maybe it means that God isn't just. And none of those things were true. Job wasn't completely innocent, but it also is true that God wasn't punishing Job because of something that he did. We know that from the first chapter. But Job wasn't able to imagine a different experience or a different understanding, a different explanation, because he was too busy just kind of pushing his own self-righteous explanation. So maybe if he could have heard from Elihu, that might have helped. And perhaps even when he does say in the final chapter that I am repenting of what I had to say, that there's a little bit of that in there. And then the other thing, very interestingly, like just fascinatingly really, that Elihu does is in his last chapter, chapter 37, we almost ought to have a spoiler alert at the beginning, warning Elihu is about to say some exactly the same things, or at least very similar things, that God is going to say in the following chapter. Elihu prefigures what God is going to say. And then finally, I won't go into depth in this, but in some ways, Elihu, when you read him through a Christian perspective, he seems to prefigure Christ without even realizing that he is. Someone who will come and pay a ransom, be a ransom for someone who is suffering. And of course, we Christians can see Christ in that. So Elihu has some stuff that is important, good stuff, and we can read that, we can test those spirits to see which is from God and which is not, and recognize that we've met the enemy, but they may be partly right. So Elihu can be a negative example for us for what not to do. Elihu also can be a positive example for us for some of the things that we can do. And in that, he is like all of us, isn't he? And so whether we are attempting to help someone who is suffering, or whether we are suffering and are out seeking help or receiving help that may not feel like help from others, let us take some lessons from Elihu and recognize that indeed we can be helpers because God is with us.